Thank you very, very much. Nice to meet all of you. I appreciate your coming and listening to my efforts to do some justice to a perspective of the Kitab-í-Aqdas. And up front, I will tell you that I am no authority on Baha'u'llah's Book of Laws, the Kitab-í-Aqdas. But like you, we're going to all learn because Baha'u'llah tells us, immerse yourself in the ocean of my words, that ye may unravel its secrets and discover all the pearls of wisdom that lay hid in its depths. Although we find those words in the proclamation of Baha'u'llah, which is the publication of the Universal House of Justice, of some of the messages to the kings and rulers of the world, that particular injunction is actually addressed to, O peoples of the world. And you will find that in the Aqdas. Some new believers, and forgive me if I'm going to read from a paper, but I'm trying to be precise in what I explain without having you listen to a bunch of ohs and ahs, so forgive me. Some new believers may innocently think that the Aqdas is for Baha'is, because we're the ones presently expected to be obedient to the laws, but only as they're given to us gradually. And today that will be done by the Universal House of Justice. But the sacred writings always educate us. For example, in the third paragraph of the Aqdas is where you will find, O ye peoples of the world, meaning that it's for the people of the world. Know assuredly that my commandments are the lamps of my loving providence among my servants. In the Secrets of Divine Civilization, Abdu'l-Baha talks about the requirements for the leaders who govern. The second essential requirement, so how you see humanity behaving now is not the way that they will behave in the future. And of course, we do know from the scriptures of other religions that this is the new Jerusalem and the bride. The Kitab-í-Aqdas, that's one of the descriptions of the Kitab-í-Aqdas, is that it's the new Jerusalem and the bride. But the most obvious proof of accepting the Aqdas as meant for all of mankind is Shoghi Effendi referring to it as the charter of the future world civilization. And we studied a few months ago, God Passes By, in which Shoghi Effendi used those terms. The Universal House of Justice, and I've said this before, about a year or two ago, told the Baha'is that we must understand the history behind everything that we see in order to better share the revelation of Baha'u'llah. And you know, everything is done gradually. So I'm going to give you a little history about the House of Justice, learning from the history and particularly the importance of Shoghi Effendi with his infallible interpretation. The Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha was officially read on 3 January 1922. You know, Abdu'l-Baha died in 1921. 1 year and 10 days after the reading of the Will and Testament, we're now into 1923, Shoghi Effendi begins sending the sacred writings to the Baha'i Assembly of America. In 1935, he sent a copy of the Gleanings. Now, in 1923, he was always sending copies, not just from the writings, but from the Aqdas itself. So when Shoghi Effendi said to America, gleanings from the writings of Baha'u'llah, he also included in that thick book selections from the Aqdas. In other words, he was giving us parts of the Aqdas gradually. Of course, he said the first would be the synopsis and codification, and then it would be the translation of the entire Kitab-í-Aqdas. But in spite of that, he was giving us parts anyway. So in 1939, America copyrighted it, and we now have copies of Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah. You will read on page 22. Oh, let me read my notes properly. In the Gleanings from the Writings, on the bottom of page 330 to the top of page 333, that section is actually the first 5 paragraphs of the Kitab-í-Aqdas. I'm more familiar with the last paragraph in the book, which is quite short, but it's the paragraph where Baha'u'llah warns anybody who would claim to be the next messenger from God before the elapse of 1,000 years. And of course, the Guardian put in the gleanings, immerse yourself in the ocean of my words, which we will read in the Kitab-í-Aqdas. Now, 9 years after sending Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi put another wonderful publication in our hands. Technically, he wrote it in 9 months, and that is God Passes By, which is a history of the first 100 years of the faith. A number of years ago, I gave a class on excerpts from God Passes By, describing Shoghi Effendi, describing the Kitab-í-Aqdas. I have that old paper in front of me. I'm not going to read it all, so don't get scared. But in the pages are 214 and 215 of God Passes By. He begins by giving 7 descriptions. You could say that the theme is to the rulers and kings. Then he says, in it, he, Baha'u'llah, and he gives another 11 descriptions of the Aqdas, beginning with formally ordaining the institution of the House of Justice, and at the end, rules out the appearance of a manifestation of God before the lapse of 1,000 years. Then he says, in this book, he moreover, and he lists 32 more descriptions of the Kitab-í-Aqdas. And those are more personal, obligatory prayers, the Huququllah, the law of inheritance. Again, after those 32, he says, apart from these provisions, Baha'u'llah exhorts his followers to, and he gives 15 more. And these are personal qualities: truthfulness, chastity, cleanliness, courtesy. He gives 4 more. And finally, he gives 9 more. Number 70 is the significance of the summons issued to the American Federation president. You know, this is the only message that in its completeness that Baha'u'llah sent to the leaders and the rulers and the clergy and the kings. Only this message to the American Federation president is printed totally in the Kitab-í-Aqdas. And that ends with number 78 description, warning his brother to beg for God's forgiveness for his inequities. On that page 215, which I won't say now, Shoghi Effendi also gives 11 titles of the Kitab-í-Aqdas. Okay, let's see what I've got here. Well, another important aspect of the Kitab-í-Aqdas is that it cannot be separated from the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha. Shoghi Effendi wrote in the World Order of Baha'u'llah that the Aqdas constitutes the chief depository wherein are enshrined those priceless elements of that divine civilization, the establishment of which is one of the primary missions of the Baha'i faith. So he calls the Kitab-í-Aqdas the charter of the future world civilization, and then he uses that same title, a charter for the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha. Interestingly enough, the Aqdas is connected with another document from Abdu'l-Baha, and it was put in the hands of the American believers. And what would that document be but the Abdu'l-Baha's divine plan? The Guardian informed us, now this is from the Priceless Pearl. You know, when I want to know something about history, there are two books I immediately go to. Among all the books on the Revelation, it's the Priceless Pearl and God Passes By. So Amata Baha Rahia Khanum, in writing the Priceless Pearl, says, the Guardian informed us that Abdu'l-Baha's divine plan had derived its inspiration from Baha'u'llah's own words in the Kitab-í-Aqdas. And then Shoghi Effendi, she says, goes on to say that it was in no small part a result of the direct contact of Abdu'l-Baha with the American and Canadian believers in the course of his journey through North America. It's like America is being weaved into the Kitab-í-Aqdas. You know, I always say there's a triangle of Baha'i history that's very relevant, and it would be the Holy Land, Persia, and the United States. When you read the early history, probably for maybe 200 or 300 of the early history, you will see this triangle connecting the faith together. Okay, I have to tell you, I found this amusing. I finally found it in the Priceless Pearl, where Shoghi Effendi says something that I humorously say was picked up by John Kennedy and used in his inaugural address of 1961. You remember he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but for what you can do for your country. Well, back in 1923, Shoghi Effendi wrote, the time has come for the Friends to think not as to how they should serve the cause, but how the cause should be served. From the Priceless Pearl, we learned from Amata Baha Rahia Khanum that when it came to the synopsis and codification of the Aqdas, she says Shoghi Effendi didn't want a legal codification of laws, but a compilation placing subjects with subjects. So those 78 descriptions, you notice that Shoghi Effendi grouped them. And then Baha'u'llah says, he grouped them in more or less this subject matter. This is important. This is not an accident, because we will learn how this guided the Universal House of Justice. The codification of the Aqdas was a 10-year plan goal Shoghi Effendi gave himself. And although he worked starting it, his untimely death in 1957 prevented its completion by him. We know that many of his goals could not be completed. The phrase became circumstances permitting. So the state of the faith, the state of the world plays a part in whether our goals can be completed or not. You may recall in the letter Advent of Divine Justice that Shoghi Effendi wrote to America, that the building of the third Masrigal Askar, the house of worship of the Baha'i world, would be the outskirts of the city of Tehran, to be followed by the rise of a similar house of worship in the Holy Land itself. Neither one of those houses of worship have been built, yet we have the land that will host these spiritual institutions. The state of the world continues to prevent us from winning some of our goals, but the goals don't go away. They will be fulfilled. In respect of Shoghi Effendi's passing during the 10-year plan, 1957, and his personal goal of codifying the laws in the mother book of the Baha'i faith, we also read in The Priceless Pearl, where Amatu Baha says this. Now picture this wonderful, devoted, faithful, hand of the cause of God, wife and widow of the guardian of the faith. She wakes up one morning and finds the guardian has died in his sleep. Her first thought, after getting somewhat over the shock, was how to break it to the friends. And she knows Shoghi Effendi's work, that he's working on this codification. So we read in The Priceless Pearl. It's on page 448 if you want to know. In accordance with the laws of the Aqdas, of which Shoghi Effendi had himself been the appointed defender, burial must take place not more than 1 hour's journey from the place of death. I knew there could be no question of breaking this law and taking his remains back to the Holy Land. In the opening words of her message, which at that time was a cable, to the Baha'is of the world, she writes, "Beloved guardian, laid rest, London, according laws Aqdas." In writing this paper, I thought, Rahia Khanum had such a love for pioneers. Think of all the pioneers scattered around the world in those days, worried about would they ever make it back to their homeland. And if they didn't, they would be buried where they served the cause their final years, just like Shoghi Effendi. So let's sum up some dates. In 1923, Shoghi Effendi is sending translations of some of the passages of the Kitab-í-Aqdas. In 1935, he sends the gleanings from the writings of Baha'u'llah, which contain excerpts from the Kitab-í-Aqdas. Then he has his 1953 self given goal of producing the codification, synopsis and codification of the Aqdas. In 1957, during the plan, he passes away. 1973, the Universal House of Justice at the Baha'i World Center finishes and publishes that codification 10 years after it was elected. Then another 20 years passes by, 1992, when the Universal House of Justice finishes translating in English and publishing what we now have in our hands, the Kitab-í-Aqdas. You know, what's very interesting and what some of the Baha'is are not aware of is the Constitution of the Universal House of Justice. When I went on my 1970 and 1972 holidays from the World Center, I made a trip to the National Baha'i Office. And while I was there, the staff asked me how the Constitution of the Universal House of Justice was going. And I had to truthfully say I didn't know anything about it. I didn't even know they were working on a constitution. But they did publish the Constitution in 1972, and you know, it's only 16 pages long. But believe me, this is linked to the Kitab-í-Aqdas. I hope you have a chance to study it. Okay, so let's review something in respect of a time schedule between Shoghi Effendi and the central figures of the faith and the Universal House of Justice. This might be helpful for those of you who are only beginning to study the Baha'i faith. Around 1873 is when Baha'u'llah reveals the Kitab-í-Aqdas in Akka. I was going to say something, it went out of my head. But according to items 2 and 3 of the synopsis, anticipates the institution of the guardianship and he formally ordains the House of Justice. Okay, that's 1873, halfway through Baha'u'llah's 40-year ministry. This is another proof of the gradualness of not only writing the Kitab-í-Aqdas, but giving it to the friends and later to the entire world, which we don't have much time to talk about. Then Baha'u'llah dies in 1892. So the first decade of the 1900s is when Abdu'l-Baha life is threatened because of the enemies of the faith and the authorities that keep him imprisoned. So he's writing the Will and Testament in those early years of the 19th century. And in those early pages, he's appointing Shoghi Effendi, who's just a mere child, as the guardian of the faith and its authorized interpreter. He passes away in 1921. So in January 1922, as I said, the will is officially read, and Shoghi Effendi is not only the guardian of the faith, but the head of the Universal House of Justice, which Ian Simple, one of the original members I'll talk about, brings that up. But then Shoghi Effendi passes away in 1957, but the faith still has his writings, and they still have the 10-year plan, after which in 1963, the Universal House of Justice comes into existence. Next Tuesday, when the preface is read, you will read, "The guardianship and the Universal House of Justice can thus be seen to be, in the words of Shoghi Effendi, the twin successors of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha." This is what is written in the preface of the Aqdas, which will be read next Tuesday. Now, there is much to relate in respect of the responsibilities of the guardian and the House of Justice, where one does not infringe upon the other. You can go into Ocean and see letters from the House of Justice. As I mentioned, I will recommend 3 letters. If you go into the Ocean and get to letters from the Universal House of Justice, these are the 3 I recommend you study. March the 9th, 1965, May the 23rd, 1966, and July the 25th, 1974, where the House speaks particularly about the guardian's infallibility. Well, as inadequate as I feel, I'm at a point of briefly covering the importance of the guardian, Shoghi Effendi's writings and interpretations to the House of Justice. His interpretations, his letters, his messages, his compilations, all of his writings, the House of Justice consults upon in order to come to the most accurate of its own writings. In the respect of the Aqdas, think how important it was for the work that Shoghi Effendi did do on the synopsis and the codification. It gave them a pattern on how to finish the synopsis and codification. Ian Simple gave a talk in Wilmette when he was on holiday. Ian Simple was one of the 2 British members of the original 9 members of the Universal House of Justice. And Ian said in his 201 Wilmette talk, which I've referenced with you before, he says how it would have been very beneficial to have had the guardian as the president and head of the House of Justice, but that in certain matters, Shoghi Effendi's writings gave the House of Justice soul-stirring hints as to how the wind was blowing. I liked Ian Simple's terminology that Shoghi Effendi was giving them a hint as to how the wind was blowing. You will read one letter where the House of Justice had to decide on abortions, and he quotes Shoghi Effendi's writings. So when Shoghi Effendi started the Kitab-í-Aqdas codification and synopsis, the House of Justice had a pattern. Think about Shoghi Effendi putting on Mount Carmel the first of the institutions of the World Center, which was the International Archives. Because the Guardian used the classical Greek Roman structure, architecture, the House of Justice continued that structure. If you can see that in the other buildings. So everything that the Shoghi Effendi did, whether it was complete or not, spoke to the House of Justice on how they should adjudicate and consult. Now, one of the things I liked that Ian said was well, let me say this. In 2001, when Ian Simple went on holiday from the work of the House of Justice, it had been about 4 months after the House of Justice put out Century of Light. I hope you've had a chance to read that. Ian quotes from that Century of Light, and this is in respect to Shoghi Effendi. It is in Century of Light, chapter 7. However great is the distance between the guardianship and the unique station of the center of the covenant. The role played by Shoghi Effendi after the master's passing stands alone in the history of the cause. It will continue to occupy in the life of the faith throughout the coming centuries. And the vehicle that will do that is the House of Justice, because it will perpetuate all the 30 years of Shoghi Effendi's services to the faith of his grandfather and his great-grandfather. Well, I have written here, it must be said that in the end, however important the work of the Aqdas in English may be, it had to be performed while Shoghi Effendi labored over all the other demands of his station as the guardian of the faith. Shoghi Effendi's worldwide communication in his 36 years amounted to 32,653 items. That's thanks to Ali Nachavani, another original member of the Universal House of Justice, who was the convener of the research department of the World Center when he was elected to the House of Justice. He gave those 32,653 items, and I calculated that if every day of his 36 years, Shoghi Effendi wrote something, it amounted to 903 items every year. Some of those items were more than just mere letters. For example, the dispensation of Baha'u'llah is 60 pages. You know, Rahia Khanum used to be asked why the guardian didn't leave a will. And her answer was, then you haven't read the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, because Shoghi Effendi said in that dispensation everything he needed to say. He told her, I've said everything I needed to say in the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. Do you know when that letter was written? The letter was written in 1934, not right before he died, because he knew if you read the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, it's in chronological station. It refers to the Bab, Baha'u'llah, Abdu Baha, and the administrative order. And he said, everything I had to say is in that, which really means everything he had to say was said by the other central figures of the faith. And the Kitab-í-Aqdas brought in the world order of Baha'u'llah. You know, the promised day has come is another letter that he addressed to America. It is 120 pages. And that's a letter that our National Assembly tells us to read regularly. I gave a class on the letters that Shoghi Effendi wrote the British Isles. This is it. And I counted the letters, 867 letters he wrote the British Isles alone. Friends, I think I've told you enough about my perspective of the Kitab-í-Aqdas. I'm sure if Neda invited 10 more people to address this subject, you'd get 10 different perspectives, but that's the one I'm sharing with you. I thank you for your patience, and you may have some questions, or you may want to give your own contribution, your own perspective, so please do.
A question about the compilation that you held up for us to read.
The Constitution?
Is that what it is? The Constitution?
Yeah, this is called the Constitution of the Universal House of Justice, published by the House of Justice in 1972.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. What I've done for my Aqdas, you'll see these 4 colored stickers. The blue one is the Aqdas, the green one is the questions and answers, the blue one is the synopsis and codification, and the last one is notes. So when you read the notes, it'll tell you what paragraph applies to the Aqdas. And then when you read the note, it leads you to references to questions and answers, or the synopsis and codification. So to make my life easier, I put these little stickers so that I could flip to the right pages. And we will be doing that in other sessions.
That's a great idea. I'm going to actually put those colors for the friends too. Shahram, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So my question is, the Book of Aqdas is the book of laws. That's my understanding.
Yes.
It's like if you want to know what the law is on a particular subject, you refer to a statute, and you read the statute to understand what the rules are. What I was wondering is the Book of Aqdas a comprehensive collection of all the laws, or are there some laws that may be found in tablets or other revealed words?
Yes, that's a good question. And I'm sure that's very true because you know the revelation of Baha'u'llah amounts to over 100 volumes. That's why when I'm asked a question, I don't go to one book for an answer. I try to find the answer that's in all of the books to come up with a complete understanding. The laws of the Kitab-í-Aqdas are addressed to peoples of the world. And the House of Justice was asked when the peoples of the world will be obedient to the laws of the Baha'i faith, because as you know, or as we will learn, there are laws against arson, murder, sexual abuse, all these things. The world will have to be obedient. Remember, Abdu'l-Baha said that the qualifications for the leaders of the world would be that they would have full knowledge of the laws of God, which means the laws of the Kitab-í-Aqdas. But the whole revelation of Baha'u'llah is addressed to the souls of people as well as their behavior. So you're absolutely right.